Hi there. Today what we're going to be doing is learning about stencils, and the stencils that we're going to be using are on acetate. They're just clear pieces of plastic, and we're going to be cutting things out. So I'm going to show you how to do the cutting part first. I have a drawing of four shoes actually, and they came from a design that was generated from the internet. So not super complicated. One's an Andy Warhol shoe and one's just a stock photo shoe. And I've got the background cut out already, which is, you can't see because of course you can't see anything that's been acetate, but I basically got 4 cutouts of shoes. And what I'm going to complete is I've got an extra detail in here, and I'm going to add the bottoms of the actual shoe holes, the bottom of the heels. And so I've got 4 little pieces of mark making, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in so that you can see that. Just so that you can see what it is that I'm doing for this aspect. So I've got 4 little squares that I'm cutting out. I'm using a stencil cutter and I'm using a healing board. And what I'm doing is I'm just trying to cut as tightly as I can to the line that I've created. And I'm pressing down really hard. And I'm actually holding the little tiny piece with my finger so that it doesn't rip. And you want to go past the holes a little bit. And then when you're done, you can just take that part away. And I've got 2 more here that I want to cut out. And so this is just the bottom of the heel of all 4 shoes. And if it isn't a completely perfect cut, you don't actually want to tear it. You do want to try and cut a little bit past it. And so you can cut a fairly thin line when you're doing stuff like this, but if it's too thin and the acetate is really thick, then what will happen is it will jump the edge. These stencils, that we're not using them for silkscreen, we're going to be using them with brayers and barons, and we're going to be creating some images with that. So this is my second piece of acetate for the shoes. Oh no, the ink that we're using is water-based, and it is in a tube format. So I put some ink out, and it looks a little bit like bird poop because it's very watery, and then the ink is there. So what you want to do is you want to massage the tube a little bit just so that the water aspect and the ink are completely attached and solidified together, so that you don't wind up with that sort of white watery bit. And I'm going to do the same thing for the black. And then what I'm going to do is I want to create a couple of colors. So I'm going to go with a light gray, a dark gray, and a black. And I'm going to put just a tiny bit of gray, black in that, and a tiny bit of black in that. Now, so that this doesn't move around when I'm using the brayers, I'm using masking tape, and I'm just putting it in a couple of balls underneath. You could also put tape right on the edge. It depends on how sticky it is. This is not very sticky, so I think I'm going to actually tape it to the edge so that it doesn't move. And I'm giving myself a little bit of room underneath so that the handles are not in the way. And in terms of mixing, I'm using a Scotty knife, and I'm just going to mix the white with the black to create a light gray. And if it's really runny, like this is super runny because it spewed out all of the water and not all of the ink, it's going to be a little bit runny, but I'm not too concerned about it because this is the first color. I have maybe too much black there, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix it into this other one. So whenever you're mixing ink, you start with a lighter color and you put the darker color into it. If you start with a darker color, it's going to be so dark that it's never going to work out for you. So and I want it to be fairly even as a coating and fairly even as a color. So I'm really mixing it well. Okay, and I just want to put it all up at the top there like that. The black I'm not going to do anything with. Okay, so because I'm a printmaker, I've got lots of different braires, and I'm just going to use one for each color. If you only have one braire at home, or you have a small piece of plexiglass, then the odds are you're going to be doing just one color at a time. But because I want to show you how to do the whole thing, I'm going to have all three. Now, the sound you're hearing, that's a good sound. This one is not making any sound because it's so watery, so I'm going to take some of the ink back. This one's not making very much sound either because it's also a little bit watery, so I'm going to take some of that ink back. You want to hear that sound. That's the sound. That's a really good sound. Now, it's going to take me a minute to set up, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use white paper, and it's going to be, this is my white area here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the Venus of Willendorf as my first stencil. So I've got a bunch of stencils here, and I don't have to necessarily use all of them. I have an outside one that's just an overall shape. I've got one that's got lots of holes in it for a gray. I've got a dark gray, and I've got a black. Well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do 3 layers instead of 4. And I'm going to use my brayer to put the ink on, and I'm just going to roll it into this area. And you can be kind of artistic about it. You don't have to be trying to be solid and clean. It can have a little bit of personality when you're rolling the ink on. I want it to be fairly even for the starting off point, and you can kind of see here that there is some variety going on, right? A little bit of jumping where it's not quite getting in there. So that's the first part that I'm doing, and I'm going to make more than one of these. So I'm going to hang this up just so that it's out of the way and not getting inky. And then I have 2 other choices, and I think I'm going to actually use this one as my second. It has quite a bit of personality. It's got a lot of holes in it. And I'm going to use the darker gray for this. And I'm rolling it, depending on what kind of stencil you have and where the holes are, you might have to go in both directions. I've got some really thin areas at the top, and so I want to make sure I get them in. And in this case, I kind of want it to be fairly even. So this is what it looks like before I take it off, and I'm going to peel this away, and now you can see that there's other personality going on there, right? The second layer. So I'm creating a value shift in there. Okay, and so I'm going to use the last one is going to be black, and I've got it cut out on Mylar, which is kind of thick, and I've got to cut it out on a really thin piece of acetate. Now the problem is there's all these little holes at the top, and I don't know if they're going to work. They're bigger holes on this one, so I'm going to try this one first and see what that's like. And you have to sort of have it so that you lined it up. The challenge with this is all of the pieces of acetate I have are a different size. So I'm going to recommend having one size of acetate, making sure they're all exactly the same size, and lining them up into one corner to get the better registration. Now I'm not getting any of these little dots. If I was doing this as a silk screen, I would be able to really push the ink through it. Now I've got kind of soft rollers. You could also use a paintbrush or a stippling brush if the holes are really tiny, because the brayer you have is actually quite tough. It was just, that was the only one they had in stock, and so we had to go with that one. COVID is making it really hard to get things in stock. Okay, so it didn't really work at the top, but it's not bad. And I have, 3 values in there. Now I could keep going and I could just keep doing it again and again and again. I have a little bit of extra stuff happening there because it moved. And so that's one stencil print. Now I might want to do a whole bunch of them, and if that's the case, I could do a whole bunch, and I've got all the ink there. So I'm going to do one more, and I'm going to do it in a green paper this time. And order of operations is still important, so I'm going to start off with my lightest gray. Yikes. Lightest. And you can shift it around too. It doesn't have to always be in exactly the same spot every time, unless it is all about getting the registration just right. But playing around with that is what this exercise is also about, is seeing how you can create some variety with just where things are placed or ill-placed, right? So that's another thing to consider. And generally you would actually let these dry in between each one, but for the sake of the demonstration and time, I am not doing that. I am just jumping right in and putting it on top each time. And it is really tricky when you have a dirty stencil. So we'll see how well this one turns out. So the registration of the stencil is critical. And so having them be all exactly the same size is a really good strategy. And if you have less ink, the other thing that happens, which is kind of nifty, is it will turn around and give you these lovely little marks that are just singular lines. So this stencil is exactly the same size as my paper, and I am going to maybe just do one because my camera might just shut off on me and I don't want that to happen. The way it is. Okay, so that's the first step, is layer 1. And it's going to have a bit of a rough quality to it, but you know what? I think that just makes it more charming, and I'm going to go with that. I have little tiny flowers as well in this one, so I'm going to take, sometimes I don't use the flowers, so whenever there's a stencil part you don't like or didn't turn out or are not happy with it or whatever, you can just put tape on top of it or under it. It's better to go under than over. And then that way that blocks off that area. So this is going to be right on top of this, like that. It isn't in our kit because I didn't think we'd be stenciling, but a stipple brush is a very flat, very stiff brush, and this has a lot of something in it. It's very dusty, and so I'm just going to do that with the ink, and I'm just going to stipple it into the smaller areas because they didn't really work. And maybe I'll even go in with this too. There we go. So that's another strategy for stenciling. It's a little bit more time consuming, but it's a bit more accurate. Okay, so then we have some shoes. There are all kinds of things that you could be doing. You could be doing a skull. This is another one I have that would look good in gray. And so it is based on the Neanderthal skull of Lucy. And so this is what I'm working from. And I think that or she in this case. Okay, let's see how that looks with the other layer on top. Yes, it'd be better if it was white, but I don't have any white out. So that's kind of a quick version of that, but it's kind of three-dimensional, you know, and so you can roll it out with different amounts of ink to give you some of that variety. So you're going to try it yourself. You're going to be looking at the whole, I'm going to make a stencil and it's going to have a couple of different layers on it, and it doesn't matter what color you're using. You could just go with monochromatic, or, you know, you could be using orange, or you could be using turquoise, or you could be using pink. And yes, you can make all of those colors with the blue, yellow, and red that you have. So try it yourself, and that's what your project is going to be. You're going to be making a stencil that has a couple of layers, and you're going to try printing it a bunch of different ways. So that's what we're doing for Seneca, for the stencil project. Okay? See you soon. Another thing that's really important, don't put the paint or the ink down the sink. Put it in the garbage, or better yet, just make sure you use it all up. When you're washing the brayers, you don't need to use soap, but it is a good idea to make sure that you are really scrubbing the sides. You don't want to gum up the edges of the roller, specifically where it is keyed into the sides. And that when you're drying it out, you want to make sure that you're lying it this way, not on the ground, because you don't want to affect the roller and have it sit in the muck. And you can for sure use warm water. That's totally fine. And lastly, you just want to try not to put very much of the ink down the sink. So try and use it all up as much as possible. You can, if you have way too much ink down there, you know, put it in a Tupperware container and you can use it again. It will keep forever as long as the Tupperware is pretty tightly bound. And your acetate, you know, you do want to wash that as well. And no soap on any of these things. It's not a food thing that you have to worry about. It's not a sanitary thing. It's just find that if there's any residue of the soap on it later, it's kind of problematic for printing. So it is better to just not bother using soap, and to just remember that your stencils might be a little bit fragile. There might be some floating pieces, and so you want to really make sure that you clean it well. Like this has a big floaty piece in it, right? So I want to make sure that stays that I'm careful with it. So I tend to try and wash these things with just a little bit of care. I like to use a fingernail brush, but even that, you have to be a little bit careful with it. And then I just hang these up to dry, and then I don't have to worry about them again. And they will last for 40,000 years, so you don't have to worry about them biodegrading or anything like that. But you do want to make sure that when you clean them, that you do hang them up so that they're completely dry the next time you use them, because it is water-based ink, and it will reconstitute with a wet piece of acetate. Okay, so that's the other thing you need to know in terms of cleanup. Scrape it off or use it up, and don't put it down the sink. And when you're washing your acetate, hang it up, and you don't need to use soap.